Look, ma'am, we know exactly why you're sitting here. Same little act every time. Roll in, take up a table, nurse one cup of tea, then wait for somebody to feel sorry for you.
Officer, I paid for my tea. I'm only waiting for my ride.
Your ride must be tired of you too, because nobody's coming.
I'm a paying customer. I'm only asking to be treated fairly.
No, you're making people uncomfortable, and I'm not asking you again to leave.
Harlan pressed his hand over her mouth. Everyone in Mabel's seemed to hold their breath. Elijah Baptiste stood from his booth.
Take your head off her.
Harlan smirked.
Sit down before you make your morning worse.
Pike stepped closer.
Trying to be a hero? Tough guy?
Elijah didn't move.
I'm trying to let an old woman breathe.
Neither cop knew the quiet black man was a Navy SEAL, and Elijah had no idea the woman they humiliated could change his life forever. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The old couch springs groaned as Elijah Baptiste shifted his weight, trying to find a position that didn't make his left knee scream. The digital clock on the cable box glowed 4:47 a.m., 3 more minutes until his alarm would buzz. But sleep had abandoned him hours ago anyway. He pressed his palm against the knee, feeling the familiar heat radiating through the joint. The doctors at the VA had fancy words for it: chronic inflammation from shrapnel fragments too close to major nerves to remove safely. What they meant was simple. It would hurt every day for the rest of his life. The foreclosure notice sat on the coffee table like a sleeping snake. Elijah had read it so many times he could recite the legal language by heart. Final notice of default. Property will be sold at public auction unless full payment of $8,347 is received by November 30th. 5 days. He had 5 days. The house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, smaller somehow. When he was growing up, these walls had seemed to stretch forever. His mother's voice would carry from the kitchen to the back bedrooms, calling him and Naomi for dinner. Now the silence pressed in from every corner. From down the hallway came the soft sound of Isaiah mumbling in his sleep. The boy talked to himself in dreams, working through problems his 10-year-old mind couldn't solve during the day. Last night Elijah had caught fragments, something about backpack straps and mean kids at school. Naomi's breathing was deeper, steadier. She worked 12-hour shifts at the nursing home, helping elderly residents who reminded Elijah of his mother in those final months. His sister deserved better than this couch arrangement, but the flood in their apartment complex had left them with nowhere else to go. Elijah pushed himself upright, biting back a grunt as his knee protested. The hardwood floor was cold against his bare feet. He moved carefully through the darkness, muscle memory guiding him around the furniture his mother had arranged decades ago. In the kitchen, he flicked on the small light over the stove. The coffee maker held enough grounds for 1 cup, maybe 2 if he stretched it thin. Naomi would need caffeine more than he would. She had the day shift at the nursing home, then her evening classes to finish her LPN certification. Elijah could survive on the bitter vending machine coffee at the security office. The refrigerator hummed and clicked. Inside, the shelves looked barren. A carton of milk with 2 days left, half a loaf of bread. Some leftover soup Naomi had made stretch across 3 meals. The empty spaces seemed to mock him. Isaiah's backpack sat on the kitchen counter where the boy had dropped it after school. One of the straps had torn away from the main compartment, leaving the zipper hanging at an awkward angle. Elijah pulled out a roll of duct tape from the junk drawer and got to work. His mother used to say that broken things deserved fixing, not replacing. Make do with what you have, she'd tell him while mending clothes or patching holes in the porch screen. Waste not, want not. The duct tape wasn't pretty, but it would hold. Isaiah wouldn't have to carry his books in a garbage bag like some of the other kids Elijah had seen waiting for the school bus. He set the repaired backpack by the front door and checked the time. 5:15 a.m. Naomi's alarm would go off in 45 minutes. Outside, South Harbor was still wrapped in darkness. Streetlights created small pools of yellow on the cracked sidewalks. Mrs. Althea Green's house sat diagonal across the street, its porch light burning steadily. She always left it on, had since her husband died 3 years ago. Elijah slipped on his jacket and stepped into the cool morning air. His breath formed small clouds as he crossed the street. Mrs. Green's mailbox was one of the old-fashioned kinds, metal painted green with her house number stenciled in white. The paint was chipping now, but she kept the inside clean and dry. He pulled a $5 bill from his wallet, money he'd planned to use for lunch, and slipped it into an envelope with her name written in his careful handwriting. No note, no explanation. Just enough for the bus fare to her doctor's appointment downtown. She'd never ask for help directly, but Elijah had noticed her checking the bus schedule taped to her kitchen window. Pride was a luxury poor people couldn't always afford, but dignity was different. Mrs. Green had taught Sunday school for 40 years before arthritis bent her fingers too badly to write on the chalkboard. She'd fed half the neighborhood kids when their parents worked late shifts. She deserved to keep her dignity intact. Back inside his mother's house, Elijah moved through his morning routine with military precision. Shower in 4 minutes, teeth brushed, uniform pressed and ready from the night before. His security guard badge hung from a lanyard that had seen better days, but it was clean and positioned correctly. The dream felt farther away each morning. He'd sketched it out on notebook paper months ago, a veterans community center in the empty lot, where Miller's Hardware used to stand. A place where guys like him could find work, talk through the hard stuff, maybe help younger veterans avoid the mistakes that led to sleeping on couches in their 40s. The notebook was tucked in his dresser drawer, buried under bills and medical paperwork. Some dreams were too fragile to expose to daylight. A white envelope had been shoved under his front door sometime during the night. Elijah recognized the expensive letterhead before he opened it. Whitmore Development Group. Again, "Dear property owner," it began, as if Grant Whitmore gave a care about property owners who weren't millionaires. "We are pleased to extend our final relocation assistance offer for your property at 247 Cedar Street. Our cash offer of $45,000 represents a generous premium above current market value." Generous. The word tasted bitter in Elijah's mouth. His mother had paid more than that for the house in 1987, when South Harbor was just another working-class neighborhood instead of prime real estate waiting to be revitalized. The letter mentioned community improvement and economic development. It talked about bringing jobs and opportunity to South Harbor. What it didn't mention was what happened to the people who couldn't afford to live in the new South Harbor, where they were supposed to go when their neighborhoods became too expensive for the people who'd built them. Elijah folded the foreclosure notice and slipped it into his jacket pocket, next to his heart. His mother's photograph smiled at him from the mantel, surrounded by fake flowers that never needed water. "I won't lose the house, Mama," he whispered. "I promise." The morning shift change was visible from 3 blocks away. Elijah watched through the windshield of his beat-up Honda as nurses in scrubs hurried toward the hospital, their coffee cups steaming in the cool air. Night shift security was over, but his real day was just beginning. Mabel's Diner sat on the corner of Harbor and 3rd, its neon sign flickering between open and pen like it had for the past decade. The building showed its age, peeling paint around the windows and a front door that stuck in humid weather, but the food was honest and the coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Elijah counted the bills in his wallet twice before getting out of the car. $7.32. Enough for toast and black coffee if he was careful with the tip. His stomach had been growling for the past hour, but eating was a luxury he couldn't afford until payday. The dinner bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt out of place with his mood. Every booth was occupied, filled with the usual morning crowd. Nurses grabbing breakfast after night shifts, retirees stretching their Social Security checks over bottomless coffee cups, bus drivers on their breaks, and construction workers whose day started before sunrise. The air was thick with bacon grease and conversation. Someone was arguing about the local football team's chances this season. A woman near the window was showing off pictures of her granddaughter to anyone who would look. The normality of it all made Elijah's chest tighten. These people had routines, comfortable lives, futures that extended beyond the next mortgage payment. Grace Miller waved from behind the counter, her ponytail bouncing as she moved between the coffee pots and the grill. She was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of smile that made customers feel welcome, even when they could only afford the cheapest items on the menu. "Morning, Elijah," she called over the noise. "Counter or booth today?" "Counter's fine." He slid onto one of the red vinyl stools that had probably been there since the Carter administration. The padding was thin, but it put him in position to see the whole restaurant. "Coffee to start?" "Coffee and wheat toast. Dry." He pulled his phone from his pocket and set it face up on the counter. The screen remained stubbornly blank. Commander Peterson had promised to call this morning about the security contract in Atlanta. 6 months of work, good pay, enough to catch up on the mortgage and maybe put some money aside. The catch was simple. He'd have to leave South Harbor, leave Naomi and Isaiah, leave the house his mother had died in. Grace poured his coffee without comment. She'd seen enough working people to recognize when someone was counting every penny. The toast came up golden brown, and she didn't charge extra for the small pat of butter she slipped onto the plate. Across the diner, near the window booth, sat an elderly black woman in a wheelchair. Her silver hair was neatly combed, and she wore a plain cardigan that had seen many washings but was clean and pressed. A small purse sat in her lap, and she kept checking an old flip phone with growing concern. The woman, Mrs. Lillian Beaumont, according to the name Grace had called when she'd arrived, had ordered tea and a biscuit 20 minutes ago. Now she was looking around the diner with the patient expression of someone accustomed to waiting. "Excuse me, dear," Mrs. Beaumont said to Grace as she passed with the coffee pot. Her voice was soft but clear, with the careful diction of someone who'd been educated to speak properly. "Would it be possible to charge my phone? My ride seems to be running late, and the battery died." Grace glanced toward the manager's office, where Ralph Denning was shuffling papers with nervous energy. "Of course, Mrs. Beaumont. There's an outlet right behind you." "Thank you." "You're very kind." Ralph emerged from his office, straightening his tie and smoothing down his thinning hair. His face wore the expression of a man trying to solve a problem he didn't want to deal with. He approached Grace at the coffee station, speaking in low tones that didn't carry far, but made his anxiety obvious. "How long has she been here?" Ralph asked, nodding toward Mrs. Beaumont. "Maybe half an hour? She ordered tea, and the police were here yesterday. Warned all the businesses about loiterers hanging around before the investor tour next week. Said we need to keep the area looking, you know." Grace's smile faded. "She's not loitering, Mr. Denning. She's a paying customer waiting for her ride. I'm not saying she's doing anything wrong. I'm just saying we need to be careful. These investors are looking at the whole district. We can't afford to lose business." Elijah's phone buzzed once, then went silent. A text message, not the call he'd been waiting for. He checked the screen and felt his stomach drop. Delayed another day. Will call tomorrow. Peterson, another day of waiting. Another day of uncertainty. Another day closer to losing everything. The dinner bell jingled again as the front door opened. 2 police officers entered, their uniforms crisp and their expressions predatory. Officer Wade Harlan led the way, a thick-set white man in his late 40s with the kind of mustache that belonged in old westerns. His partner, Officer Brent Pike, was younger and leaner, with cold blue eyes that swept the diner like he was cataloging threats. Conversations quieted as they passed. Even the retirees looked down at their coffee cups. Harlan's gaze fixed on Mrs. Beaumont immediately. He nudged Pike and jerked his head in her direction. They approached her table with the slow, deliberate steps of men who expected to be obeyed without question. Officer Harlan stopped beside Mrs. Beaumont's table, his bulk casting a shadow across her teacup. "Ma'am, I need to ask why you're here bothering paying customers." Mrs. Beaumont reached into her small purse with trembling fingers and pulled out a crumpled receipt. "I paid for my tea, officer. Here's my receipt." Harlan barely glanced at the paper before snatching it from her hand. "This doesn't prove anything. Could be from yesterday. Could be fake." He crumpled the receipt and dropped it on the floor beside her wheelchair. "We've had complaints about panhandling in this area. People bothering customers, asking for handouts. I haven't asked anyone for anything, Mrs. Beaumont said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm waiting for my transportation." Officer Pike had moved silently around the table during the exchange. Now he stood directly behind her wheelchair, his presence blocking any path to the door. His hand rested casually on his radio, fingers drumming against the plastic casing. "Transportation, huh?" Pike said with a smirk. "What kind of transportation? The kind that picks up people who can't pay their bills? I told you, I paid for my tea." Mrs. Beaumont's voice carried decades of dignity, but Elijah could see the fear creeping into her eyes. "I have every right to sit here." Grace appeared at the table with the coffee pot, her face flushed with anger. "Officers, Mrs. Beaumont is telling the truth. She ordered tea and a biscuit. She paid cash. I served her myself." Harlan turned his cold stare on the young waitress. "Miss, I need you to step away from this table right now. This is police business." "But she didn't do anything wrong." "Step away. Now." Harlan's voice carried the weight of authority and barely controlled violence. "Before you make this situation worse for everyone." Grace looked toward Ralph's office, hoping for support that never came. The manager had retreated behind his desk, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact with everyone in the diner. His silence spoke louder than words. He was afraid of losing his lease, afraid of police retaliation, afraid of standing up for what was right. Mrs. Beaumont tried to turn her wheelchair around, but Pike's body blocked her movement. "Excuse me, officer. I'd like to leave now." "Nobody said you could leave yet," Pike said, his grin widening. "We're still investigating complaints about disturbances." "What disturbances?" Mrs. Beaumont's voice rose, carrying across the suddenly quiet diner. "I've been sitting here peacefully, bothering no one. I have rights. This is America." "Ma'am, you need to keep your voice down," Harlan said, stepping closer to her chair. "You're creating exactly the kind of scene we're trying to prevent." "I will not keep my voice down. I am a citizen and I—" Harlan's hand moved swiftly, covering Mrs. Beaumont's mouth with his palm. Her eyes went wide with shock and terror as his thick fingers pressed against her lips. "There we go," Harlan said in a mockingly gentle tone. "Nice and calm. We're just trying to keep you from getting yourself into more trouble." Pike's laughter cut through the stunned silence of the diner. "That's better. See how quiet things get when people cooperate?" He leaned down closer to Mrs. Beaumont's ear. "Nobody's coming to save you, lady, so you might as well make this easy on yourself." The entire diner had fallen silent except for the hiss of the coffee machine and the distant sound of traffic outside. Customers stared into their plates or out the windows, anywhere but at the scene unfolding near the front booth. The elderly man at the counter gripped his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles had gone white. A mother with 2 small children hurried them toward the back exit. Elijah's phone erupted into sound, its ringtone cutting through the tension like a knife. Commander Peterson's name flashed on the screen, the call he'd been waiting for, the job that could save his house, his future, everything he'd been fighting to hold on to. But when he looked up from the phone, he saw Mrs. Beaumont's eyes above Harlan's hand. They weren't just afraid anymore. They were pleading, desperate, filled with the kind of terror that came from realizing you were completely alone in a world that had forgotten your worth. Elijah's finger hovered over the answer button. 6 months of work, good pay, a chance to start over. Instead, he let the call go to voicemail and stood up. The legs of his stool scraped against the linoleum floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Every head in the diner turned toward him. Harlan's eyes narrowed as they fixed on this new threat. "Sir, I'm going to need you to sit back down," Harlan said, his hand still covering Mrs. Beaumont's mouth. "This doesn't concern you." Elijah remained standing, his military posture unmistakable even in civilian clothes. "Yes, it does." Pike moved away from Mrs. Beaumont's wheelchair, his hand dropping to his belt where his radio and other equipment hung. "You heard him. Sit down before you make this worse." "I'm not sitting down." Pike's face flushed red. "You think you're tough, old man? You think this is your business?" Without warning, Pike shoved Elijah hard in the chest with both hands. The force sent Elijah stumbling backward into an empty table. Coffee cups crashed to the floor, plates shattered against the linoleum, and silverware scattered in every direction. Someone screamed. A child started crying. Elijah caught himself against the wall, his injured knee screaming in protest. For a moment, every instinct from his military training urged him to respond with overwhelming force. Pike was young, overconfident, and had just made the mistake of putting his hands on a trained killer. But Elijah had learned control in places where control meant the difference between life and death. He steadied himself, pushed off from the wall, and looked directly into Harlan's eyes. "Take your hand off her mouth, now." The diner held its breath. Coffee still dripped from the overturned table onto the cracked linoleum floor. Broken plates lay scattered like puzzle pieces around Elijah's feet. But he moved forward anyway, stepping carefully through the debris until he stood between Mrs. Beaumont and the two officers. Elijah kept his hands open at his sides, palms visible, but his body carried the coiled readiness of someone who had survived combat in places most people couldn't imagine. His voice remained steady, controlled. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Mrs. Beaumont shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks where Harlan's fingers had pressed against her skin. "Sir, you need to step back right now," Harlan said, finally removing his hand from Mrs. Beaumont's mouth. "You're interfering with police business." "This isn't police business," Elijah replied. "This is two grown men terrorizing an elderly woman who paid for her tea and has done nothing wrong." Pike's face had turned purple with rage. "You just assaulted a police officer by resisting lawful commands. I haven't touched either of you." "Yet?" Pike's hand moved to his baton, fingers wrapping around the black composite handle. "But you're about to learn what happens when you play hero." The baton came up fast, cutting through the air toward Elijah's jaw. But Pike was angry, sloppy, telegraphing his movements like an amateur. Elijah had fought trained killers in desert compounds and jungle clearings. He saw the swing coming from the moment Pike's shoulder shifted. The baton cracked across Elijah's jaw with a sound like wood splitting. Pain exploded through his skull, and he staggered sideways, blood filling his mouth. But he didn't fall. Couldn't fall. Not with Mrs. Beaumont behind him. "Elijah!" Grace screamed from somewhere behind the counter. Harlan moved while Elijah was still reeling from the baton strike. The officer grabbed Elijah from behind, wrapping thick arms around his chest and driving him backward into the nearest booth. The vinyl seat split under their combined weight. The table cracked down the middle. But Harlan had made a mistake. He'd grabbed Elijah like he was restraining some drunk weekend warrior, not someone who had been trained to escape from enemy captivity. Elijah dropped his weight, pivoted his hip, and drove his elbow back into Harlan's solar plexus. The officer's grip loosened just enough. Elijah spun around, caught Pike's wrist, as the younger officer swung the baton again and twisted. Pike screamed as the weapon clattered across the floor. In one fluid motion, Elijah pivoted Pike around and pressed him face first against the lunch counter, controlling his arm without breaking it. "I don't want to hurt you," Elijah said, breathing hard, "but I won't let you hurt her." Pike thrashed against the counter, knocking over salt shakers and sugar dispensers. "Get off me! Get off me!" Harlan charged like a linebacker, lowering his shoulder and driving Elijah away from his partner. They crashed through an empty table, wood and metal exploding around them. Something sharp, probably a piece of the broken table frame, carved a line across Elijah's eyebrow. Blood ran into his left eye, turning half the world red. They rolled across the floor, scattering more debris. Harlan was bigger, heavier, and had the advantage of protective gear under his uniform. He landed punch after punch into Elijah's ribs, each blow driving the air from his lungs. But Elijah had learned long ago that taking damage wasn't the same as losing. He absorbed the punishment, protected his head, and waited for his opening. When it came, Harlan pulling back for a haymaker punch, Elijah caught the officer's arm and rolled him over. Around them, the diner had erupted into chaos. Most customers had fled, but Grace stood behind the counter with her phone raised, recording everything. Her hands shook, but she kept the camera steady. "Please stop!" Mrs. Beaumont called out, her voice breaking. "Please, somebody make them stop." Pike had recovered his balance and was reaching for something on his belt. Pepper spray, maybe, or his taser. Elijah saw the movement in his peripheral vision and made a choice that would haunt him later. He left himself open to another punch from Harlan, took the blow across his already cut eyebrow, and lunged toward Pike. The tackle sent both men crashing into the pie display case. Glass exploded everywhere, mixing with the blood on the floor. Pike's head bounced off the counter with a hollow thud, and he dropped to one knee, dazed. Harlan was on Elijah's back again, one arm around his throat, trying for a chokehold. But the angle was wrong, and Elijah had been choked by professionals. He drove backward into the wall, crushing Harlan between his body and the painted cinder blocks. Once, twice, until the officer's grip loosened. Elijah spun around, blood streaming from his eyebrow and the corner of his mouth. His ribs screamed with each breath, and his injured knee felt like it might buckle. But he was still standing, still between Mrs. Beaumont and the officers who had put their hands on her. Mrs. Beaumont's fingers found the small pendant hidden beneath her cardigan. She pressed it once, twice, her hand shaking so badly she could barely manage the simple action. Outside, tires screeched against asphalt. A black SUV skidded to a stop in front of the diner, and car doors slammed. The front door burst open, and a sharply dressed black woman in her 50s strode into the wreckage of Mabel's diner, followed by two men in dark suits who looked like they could bench press police cars. "Mrs. Beaumont," the woman called out, her voice cutting through the chaos with professional authority. "Are you hurt?" The paramedic's hands were gentle but thorough as she cleaned the blood from Elijah's split eyebrow. He sat on the back bumper of the ambulance, wincing every time she touched the tender skin around the cut. "You're going to need 4 stitches," she said, preparing the needle. "Maybe 5. This one's deep." Elijah nodded, watching the controlled chaos outside Mabel's diner. The entire block had been transformed. Police cars lined the street with their red and blue lights painting the early morning in alternating colors. Crime scene tape fluttered in the harbor breeze. News vans were already arriving, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky like metal flowers. But what drew his attention was the scene near Mrs. Beaumont's wheelchair. The woman who had entered the diner, Denise Holloway, he'd learned, moved between witnesses with the precision of someone accustomed to gathering facts under pressure. She handed business cards to Grace, to the bus driver who'd stayed to give his statement, to the elderly man who'd watched everything from the corner booth. 2 men in expensive suits flanked Mrs. Beaumont's wheelchair like human shields. They weren't police officers, they weren't EMTs, they were private security, and they carried themselves like professionals who took their jobs seriously. Officers Harlan and Pike stood beside their patrol car, no longer swaggering or confident. Pike held an ice pack against the back of his head where he'd hit the counter. Harlan's uniform shirt was torn, and his face had gone pale when Denise introduced herself. "Ma'am," Harlan had stammered, "we had no idea. I mean, she looked like we were responding to a complaint about what, officer?" Denise's voice had cut through his excuses like a blade through paper. About an elderly black woman sitting quietly in a diner, drinking tea she'd paid for, waiting for her ride. The paramedic finished with Elijah's eyebrow and moved to examine his ribs. Each breath still hurt, but nothing felt broken. He'd survived worse in Afghanistan, though that didn't make the aching any easier to ignore. Mrs. Beaumont's wheelchair approached the ambulance. Up close, without the fear and chaos of the diner fight, Elijah could see her more clearly. Her eyes held intelligence and something else, a kind of watchful sadness that reminded him of veterans who'd seen too much. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "I'll live." Elijah tested his jaw, grateful it still moved properly. "Are you hurt? I saw what they—" "I'm fine, thanks to you." She studied his face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people quickly. "My attorney tells me you're Elijah Baptiste, former Navy SEAL." "Yes, ma'am. I'm Lillian Beaumont." She waited, as if expecting recognition. Elijah shook his head apologetically. "Should I know that name?" For the first time since he'd met her, Mrs. Beaumont smiled. It transformed her entire face, erasing years of careful guardedness. Most people don't. I prefer it that way. Denise approached with a tablet in her hands. Mrs. Beaumont, the officers are claiming they were responding to a panhandling complaint. Manager says someone called about a disturbance, but he can't produce any documentation. The waitress has video of the entire incident on her phone. Good. Mrs. Beaumont's voice carried quiet authority. Make sure she gets copies before anyone suggests the footage might disappear. Elijah looked between them, confusion growing. Ma'am, I don't understand what's happening here. Officer Harlan and his partner just tried to arrest the founder and CEO of Beaumont Mobility Systems, Denise explained, her tone carrying barely contained satisfaction. One of the largest medical technology companies in the Southeast. Mrs. Beaumont is worth approximately $2 billion. The words hit Elijah like cold water. He stared at Mrs. Beaumont, Lillian, trying to reconcile the woman in the plain cardigan with what he'd just heard. I came to South Harbor quietly, Lillian said, watching his reaction. No security detail, no assistance, no jewelry or obvious signs of wealth. I'd heard rumors that elderly residents, disabled people, and black families were being harassed by police before some kind of redevelopment deal. I wanted to see the truth for myself. And you found it? Elijah said quietly. I found more than I expected. Her eyes held his. I found someone willing to risk everything to protect a stranger he believed had nothing. The paramedic finished her examination and packed up her equipment. You should see a doctor if those ribs keep hurting, she told Elijah, and change the bandage on that cut twice a day. As she walked away, Lillian moved her wheelchair closer. Mr. Baptiste, may I ask you something personal? Yes, ma'am. What will this cost you? Elijah's laugh held no humor. Probably everything. The officers will file charges. I'll lose my security license. There was a job opportunity, out of state, good pay, but they won't hire someone with assault charges pending. He touched the bandage over his eyebrow. I've got 3 days to make a payment on my mother's house or lose it to foreclosure. You knew all that when you stood up. Yes, ma'am. Lillian was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Around them, the controlled chaos continued. Police radios crackled. Witnesses gave statements. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the broken glass and scattered debris that marked where 2 men had tried to silence an elderly woman's voice. Mr. Baptiste, Lillian said finally, I'd like to offer you a job. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. Ma'am, I've been planning something called the Beaumont Dignity Project. Community protection services for seniors, disabled residents, veterans, and families facing displacement. I need someone to lead it, someone who understands what it means to protect people who can't protect themselves. The words seemed to float in the air between them. Too good to be real. Elijah had learned long ago to be suspicious of offers that sounded like miracles. I don't understand, he said carefully. The pay would be enough to save your home and support your family. Full medical coverage, authority to hire a team of veterans and community advocates, resources to actually make a difference. Elijah's phone buzzed again, more insistently. This time he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The text message made his blood turn cold. Naomi, 2 police officers outside the house. They're asking for you. What do I tell them? Lillian noticed his expression change. What is it? He showed her the message. It's starting already. Then we'd better move quickly. Lillian's voice carried the steel of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. Will you help me expose what's really happening in South Harbor, Mr. Baptiste? Will you help me turn this into something that protects people instead of just punishing the guilty? Elijah looked down at his phone, then back at the woman who'd just offered him hope, disguised as employment. 3 hours ago, he'd been nobody special, a broke veteran trying to save his mother's house. Now he was bleeding outside a diner, facing charges and being offered a chance to matter again by one of the richest women in Georgia. His ribs ached with every breath. His eyebrow throbbed under its bandage. His phone buzzed with another message from Naomi, probably more urgent than the first. But when he looked at Lillian Beaumont, He saw the same thing he'd seen in the diner, someone who needed protection, even if she could hire an army to provide it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll help you." Elijah's knee burned with each step as he turned onto Magnolia Street. The morning sun cast long shadows between the old oak trees that lined his block, their Spanish moss swaying in the harbor breeze like gray curtains. The familiar sight of his mother's house, white clapboard siding, blue shutters, the porch swing where she used to shell peas, should have brought comfort. Instead, his chest tightened when he saw the patrol car parked at the curb. Officers Harlan and Pike stood near his front steps like sentries guarding a fortress. Even from half a block away, Elijah could see the evidence of their earlier confrontation. Harlan's left cheek had swollen to twice its normal size, and Pike kept his right wrist pressed close to his body, trying to hide the way it trembled. Naomi stood on the porch in her scrubs, still wearing the ID badge from her shift at Harbor View Nursing Home. Her arms were crossed tight across her chest, and every line of her body screamed tension. Behind her, barely visible in the doorway, Isaiah peered around the screen door with wide, frightened eyes. Elijah forced himself to walk normally despite the fire in his ribs. He kept his hands loose at his sides and his face carefully neutral. These next few minutes would determine whether his morning act of courage became his family's destruction. "There he is," Pike said as Elijah approached. His voice carried the false cheer of a man trying to sound confident while nursing injuries. The hero himself. Harlan turned, and Elijah got his first clear look at the damage. The officer's face was a canvas of purple and red, his left eye nearly swollen shut. But his remaining good eye burned with the kind of rage that promised retribution. "Elijah Baptiste," Harlan said, his words slightly slurred by swollen lips. "We need to have a conversation." "Good morning, officers." Elijah stopped at the bottom of his porch steps, careful to keep distance between them. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Help?" Pike laughed, a harsh sound that made Isaiah flinch behind the screen door. "You've done enough helping for one day." Naomi's knuckles had gone white where she gripped her arms. Elijah could see the fear in her eyes, not fear of him, but fear for him. She knew, just as he did, that this moment balanced on a knife's edge. "We're here to inform you," Harlan said, pulling out a small notebook with his uninjured hand. "The charges are being filed in connection with the incident at Mabel's Diner this morning. Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, disturbing the peace." The words hit Elijah like physical blows, but he kept his expression steady. "I see. You attacked 2 sworn officers who were conducting official police business," Pike added, his voice rising with indignation. "Unprovoked assault on men trying to maintain public safety." Elijah thought of Lillian's terrified eyes when Harlan covered her mouth. He thought of Pike's laughter echoing through the diner. He thought of Grace's shaking hands as she tried to defend an elderly woman who'd done nothing wrong except exist in a space where she wasn't wanted. "I understand you have your version of events," Elijah said carefully. "Our version." Harlan's swollen face twisted into something resembling a smile. "Son, we're the law. Our version is the only version that matters." Behind them, Isaiah pressed closer to the screen door. The boy's presence reminded Elijah of everything he stood to lose. Not just the house, not just his own future, but the safety of the only family he had left. "The thing is," Pike said, taking a step closer, "charges like these have a way of affecting a man's life. Employment prospects, professional licenses, housing applications." He paused meaningfully. "Military benefits." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Elijah felt his hands clench involuntarily, then forced them to relax. This was the trap. This was how they turned victims into criminals, by making them react. "You seem like a smart man," Harlan continued, dabbing at his split lip with a tissue. "Smart enough to understand that heroes sometimes lose things. Important things." Naomi made a small, choked sound. Elijah glanced up at her and saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She was thinking about Isaiah's school, about their temporary stability, about how quickly everything could disappear. "Are you threatening me, officers?" Elijah asked quietly. "Threatening?" Pike's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "We're just explaining reality. Actions have consequences. Sometimes those consequences affect more than just the person who made the choice." His gaze shifted deliberately to Isaiah, then back to Elijah. The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd written it in block letters. Elijah felt something cold settle in his stomach. These men weren't just angry about their injuries or their public humiliation. They were angry that someone like him had dared to challenge their authority. They intended to make sure he remembered his place. "We'll be in touch about the court date," Harlan said, closing his notebook with a snap. "Until then, I'd recommend keeping a low profile, staying out of situations that might be misinterpreted." The officers walked back to their patrol car with deliberate slowness, letting their presence linger like a bad smell. Pike paused with his hand on the passenger door. "Oh, and Baptiste?" he called across the yard. "You might want to let your family know that this kind of publicity doesn't always stay local. News travels fast these days. Employers talk to each other." They drove away, leaving Elijah standing in his front yard with the taste of blood still in his mouth and the weight of consequences settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Naomi waited until the patrol car disappeared around the corner before she spoke. When she did, her voice cracked like breaking glass. "Elijah, what have you done?" He climbed the porch steps slowly, each movement sending fresh pain through his injured ribs. Isaiah backed away from the screen door as he approached, eyes still wide with confusion and fear. Inside the house, Naomi collapsed into the kitchen chair she'd been sitting in hours earlier when he'd left for the diner. She buried her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "They're going to destroy us," she whispered through her fingers. "You know that, right? They're going to take everything." Elijah sat across from her at the scarred wooden table his mother had bought at a church sale 20 years ago. The foreclosure notice still lay where he'd left it, but now it was joined by something else. Lillian Beaumont's business card, elegant and cream-colored, with raised lettering that spoke of serious money. "Naomi," he said gently, "you didn't see what they were doing to her." She looked up, and her eyes blazed with a mixture of love and fury that only a sister could achieve. "I don't care what they were doing to her. I care about Isaiah. I care about this roof over our heads. I care about you not ending up dead or in prison because you can't walk away from a fight that isn't yours. She's elderly, disabled. They covered her mouth to keep her quiet. And now they're going to cover our mouths by destroying our lives." Naomi slammed her hand on the table, making the foreclosure notice jump. "Elijah, we're 3 days away from being homeless. 3 days! And you picked a fight with 2 police officers!" The words hung between them like an accusation. Elijah touched the bandage over his eyebrow, feeling the throb of his injuries and the deeper ache of knowing she was right. His phone buzzed, and he pulled it from his pocket with a sense of impending doom. The caller ID showed Meridian Security Solutions, the out-of-state company that had offered him salvation just hours earlier. "Mr. Baptiste?" The voice was professional but cold. "This is Janet Morrison from Meridian Security. We've received some concerning information about an incident involving you and local law enforcement this morning." Elijah closed his eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I'm afraid we'll need to put your application under review pending the resolution of any legal matters. We'll contact you once the situation is clarified." The line went dead. Elijah set the phone on the table next to the foreclosure notice and Lillian's business card, 3 pieces of paper that represented the crossroads of his entire life. Naomi stared at him across the table, her face wet with tears and etched with exhaustion. "How much?" she asked quietly. "How much what? How much is your conscience worth? Because I need to know if it's worth more than Isaiah's future." Elijah reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the morning warmth, and they trembled in his grip. "I couldn't walk away," he said simply. "If it had been you in that wheelchair, if it had been Isaiah they were silencing, I would have wanted someone to stand up." Naomi squeezed his hand, and for a moment the kitchen was silent except for the tick of their mother's clock and the distant sound of harbor gulls crying over the water. Between them on the table lay the evidence of his choice, his bruised and bandaged face, the foreclosure notice that would make them homeless in 3 days, and a billionaire's business card that promised everything or nothing, depending on whether miracles were real or just another kind of trap. The black sedan arrived at Elijah's house at 9 in the morning, clean and quiet, against the backdrop of South Harbor's cracked sidewalks. Elijah had been awake for hours, sitting on his mother's porch and watching the sunrise paint the harbor gold while his ribs ached and his split eyebrow throbbed. The driver was polite but professional, opening the rear door without comment about Elijah's bruised face or the borrowed dress shirt that hung loose on his frame. Naomi had pressed it into his hands that morning, one of their father's old shirts that still smelled faintly of aftershave and Sunday services. "You sure about this?" she'd asked for the third time, smoothing the collar with nervous fingers. "No," Elijah had answered honestly. "But I'm going anyway." Now, as the sedan glided through Atlanta traffic toward downtown, Elijah studied his reflection in the tinted window. The bandage over his eyebrow made him look like what he was, a man who'd been in a fight. His jaw carried a purple bruise that no amount of concealer could hide. He wondered what Lillian Beaumont's associates would think when they saw him walking into their gleaming world, looking like trouble. Beaumont Tower rose 40 stories into the Atlanta sky, all glass and steel and quiet money. The lobby felt like a cathedral, with marble floors that reflected the morning light and security guards who nodded respectfully as Elijah passed. He gave his name at the reception desk, and a young woman with a kind smile directed him to the executive elevator. His reflection multiplied in the polished walls as the elevator climbed. 40 floors of success, of decisions made in boardrooms, of problems solved with phone calls and wire transfers. Elijah had spent his adult life in military bases and security checkpoints, places where function mattered more than appearance. This felt like walking into a different country. The elevator opened onto a quiet hallway, lined with original artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows that showed Atlanta sprawling in all directions. A receptionist led him past offices where people in expensive suits spoke in measured tones about quarterly reports and strategic initiatives. Lillian Beaumont's office occupied a corner of the building, with windows facing both east and south. She sat behind a desk that looked more like a piece of art than furniture. But when she saw Elijah, she rolled her wheelchair around to greet him in the open space near the windows. "Mr. Baptiste," she said, and her voice carried the same quiet strength he remembered from the diner. "Thank you for coming." She looked different here in her element, not diminished by the wheelchair or the plain clothes, but revealed. Her silver hair was styled elegantly, and she wore a navy blue suit that spoke of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. Yet her eyes held the same warmth and pain he'd seen when Officer Harlan had covered her mouth. "Mrs. Beaumont," Elijah replied, suddenly aware of how his borrowed shirt pulled across his shoulders and how his work boots sounded against her polished floor. She gestured toward a seating area near the windows, comfortable chairs arranged around a low table, nothing that screamed power or intimidation. As they settled in, Lillian poured coffee from a thermal carafe, her movements precise despite the slight tremor in her hands. "How are your injuries?" she asked, studying the bandage over his eyebrow. "Healing, ma'am. Nothing serious." "Mr. Baptiste," she said, setting down her coffee cup with a gentle clink, "I want you to understand something from the start. What happened at Mabel's diner is not an embarrassment to me. It's not something I want to minimize or forget. It's the reason you're here." Elijah shifted in his chair, uncertain how to respond. "Ma'am, those officers assumed I was powerless because I'm old, black, and disabled. They assumed I was alone because I wasn't wearing expensive clothes or traveling with an entourage. They were wrong about my circumstances, but they were right about something else. Without you, I would have been powerless in that moment." She turned her wheelchair slightly to face the windows, where Atlanta stretched toward the horizon in a maze of highways and neighborhoods. Beaumont Mobility Systems didn't start in a boardroom like this. It started in a garage in East Point, 23 years ago, after my husband Marcus was crushed by a forklift at the textile plant where he worked. Elijah listened without speaking, recognizing the weight of memory in her voice. The accident left him paralyzed from the chest down. Our insurance company approved the cheapest wheelchair they could find, a piece of junk that broke down every few weeks. They denied coverage for a wheelchair-accessible vehicle, denied coverage for home modifications, denied coverage for the equipment that might have given him some independence. Lillian's hands tightened on her coffee cup. Marcus was a proud man. He'd worked since he was 14 years old. Suddenly, he couldn't reach his own kitchen cabinets or get into his own bathroom without help. The insurance company told us he should be grateful for what they were willing to provide. She turned back to face Elijah. So I learned to build what he needed. I bought tools and studied engineering manuals and failed 100 times before I succeeded once. The first wheelchair lift I built looked like something from a junkyard, but it worked. Marcus could get in and out of our house by himself. What happened to him? Elijah asked gently. He died 4 years later. Pneumonia. But in those 4 years, he had his dignity back, and I had discovered something about myself I never knew existed. She gestured toward the windows and the city beyond. I built this company piece by piece, invention by invention, because I learned that dignity isn't something insurance companies provide. It's something people create for each other. Lillian rolled closer to the table between them. The Beaumont Dignity Project isn't charity, Mr. Baptiste. It's investment in the kind of community I wish had existed when Marcus needed help. She opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. Elijah saw architectural drawings, budget projections, legal frameworks, and staffing plans. Legal aid for families facing illegal evictions, emergency grants for disabled residents who need home modifications, safe transportation for elderly people who've been targeted for harassment, job training and placement for veterans transitioning to civilian life, and most importantly, a network of community advocates who can respond when vulnerable people are being mistreated. Elijah studied the papers, seeing months of careful planning in every detail. This is extensive. It has to be. Systematic problems require systematic solutions. Lillian leaned forward. I want you to serve as the founding director of this initiative, not as a figurehead, not as someone grateful for rescue, but as a leader with full authority to build something that lasts. The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge he wasn't sure he could cross. Elijah thought about the foreclosure notice on his kitchen table, about Naomi's tears, about Isaiah's frightened face at the screen door. Mrs. Beaumont, he said carefully, I appreciate what you're offering, but I need to be honest. I'm not a businessman. I'm not educated the way your other employees probably are. I'm just a soldier trying to keep his family housed. Mr. Baptiste, she replied, and her voice carried the same authority he'd heard her use with the police officers. Yesterday morning, 2 armed men were humiliating and silencing an elderly disabled woman. You could have walked away. You could have called someone else to handle it. Instead, you absorbed their violence, rather than let them reach me again. She tapped one of the documents with her finger. That kind of restraint under pressure isn't common. That kind of moral clarity isn't something I can teach or buy. And that combination of physical courage and emotional discipline is exactly what this project needs. Elijah looked out at Atlanta's skyline, thinking about all the people in all those buildings who made decisions about other people's lives every day. You're sure about this? I've spent 23 years learning to recognize character, Mr. Baptiste. Yesterday, you showed me exactly who you are. Lillian reached into the folder and withdrew a single-page contract. I'm offering you a 6-month consulting agreement to start. Full salary, medical benefits, housing allowance, and complete authority to hire your initial team. If the pilot program succeeds, we'll discuss a permanent position with equity in the foundation. Elijah read the salary figure twice, certain he'd misunderstood. It was more money than he'd made in 2 years of security work. This is too much, he said quietly. It's exactly what the position is worth, Lillian replied. I'm not paying you for gratitude, Mr. Baptiste. I'm investing in results. Elijah picked up the pen she'd placed beside the contract. His hand shook slightly as he signed his name on the signature line, making a commitment that felt like stepping off a cliff into uncertain air. Thank you, he said, setting down the pen. Don't thank me yet. Lillian replied with a small smile. "Wait until you see what we're up against." 20 floors below them, in a conference room lined with mahogany and leather, 3 members of the Beaumont Foundation Board were already drafting an emergency meeting agenda, their phones buzzing with calls from reporters and their assistants fielding inquiries about police incidents and public relations disasters. But in Lillian's office, with Atlanta spreading beneath the windows like a promise of possibility, Elijah Baptiste allowed himself to believe that sometimes courage was rewarded and that good people didn't always finish last. That afternoon, Elijah drove his old Honda back to South Harbor with Lillian's signed contract folded carefully in his jacket pocket. The money felt surreal, like something that might disappear if he examined it too closely. But before he went home to tell Naomi and Isaiah the news, he had one stop to make. Mabel's diner looked different in the daylight. The morning rush had ended, leaving only a few regulars nursing coffee and reading newspapers. The booth where he'd fought officers Harlan and Pike had been repaired, but Elijah could still see faint scuff marks on the linoleum where Pike's boots had scraped during the struggle. Grace Miller stood behind the counter, refilling salt shakers with mechanical precision. When she saw Elijah enter, her face brightened with relief and something that looked like gratitude. "Mr. Baptiste," she said, glancing quickly toward the kitchen where Ralph Denning was probably listening. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Elijah replied, touching the bandage over his eyebrow. "I wanted to thank you for speaking up yesterday. That took courage." Grace's hand stilled on the salt shaker. "My father was disabled," she said quietly. "Stroke left him in a wheelchair for the last 5 years of his life. One time, police officers thought he was drunk when he was really having a medication reaction. They treated him like he was less than human." She looked around the empty diner, then leaned closer. "I swore I would never look away again when someone needed help. That's why I—" She hesitated, then pulled her phone from her apron pocket. "That's why I kept recording even when they told me to stop." Elijah's pulse quickened. "You have footage? From when they first approached Mrs. Beaumont until after the fighting stopped." Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. "You can see everything. Officer Harlan putting his hand over her mouth. Officer Pike hitting you first. You never threw a punch until they were trying to hurt her." She showed him the phone screen, and Elijah watched the terrible scene play out in miniature. There was Lillian, dignified and calm, showing her receipt. There were the officers, aggressive and mocking. There was the moment when Harlan covered her mouth, and Pike laughed about nobody coming to save her. And there was Elijah, stepping forward, not in anger, but in protection, taking blow after blow rather than letting either officer reach Lillian again. "This proves everything," Elijah said, amazed. "I know." Grace glanced toward the kitchen again. "But Mr. Denning won't let me give it to anyone official. He says the diner can't get involved in police business." As if summoned by her words, Ralph Denning emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was a thin man in his 50s with nervous eyes and the defeated posture of someone who'd spent years bending to stronger wills. "Mr. Baptiste," Ralph said, his voice carefully neutral, "I heard you were looking for our security footage." "Yes, sir. It would help clear up what happened yesterday." Ralph shook his head quickly. "I'm sorry, but our cameras weren't working properly. Technical malfunction. Nothing recorded." Elijah studied the man's face, seeing fear rather than deception. Ralph was lying, but not from malice. He was terrified. "Mr. Denning," Elijah said gently, "Mrs. Beaumont was being abused by those officers. You saw it yourself." "I saw a disturbance," Ralph replied, his words sounding rehearsed. "I saw raised voices and some pushing. These things happen. Best to let it go." Grace stared at her manager with obvious disappointment. "Ralph, you know that's not what happened." "Grace, you need to focus on your work," Ralph said sharply. "Customers don't come here for drama." Elijah felt the familiar weight of institutional silence, the same pattern that had protected bad officers and abandoned good soldiers throughout his military career. But this time, he had Lillian's resources behind him and Grace's courage beside him. "I understand," Elijah said to Ralph. "Thank you for your time." He left a $5 tip for Grace and walked outside into the humid afternoon air. Moments later, Grace appeared at the diner's side door, looking around nervously before approaching him. "I can't give this to you officially," she said, pulling out her phone again, "but I can send it to myself and then, accidentally, send it to the wrong number." She showed him her contact screen, and Elijah quietly recited his phone number. Within seconds, his phone buzzed with an incoming video file. "Thank you," he said. Grace immediately deleted the message from her sent folder and cleared her phone's recent call log. "My shift ends in an hour. After that, I don't know anything about any video. You're risking your job for this." "Some things are worth the risk," Grace replied. "My father used to say that silence in the face of cruelty makes you part of the cruelty." 20 minutes later, Elijah sat in his Honda outside his house, showing Naomi the video on his phone screen. She watched in horrified silence as Officer Harlan covered Lillian's mouth and Pike struck Elijah with his baton. "Oh my God," Naomi whispered when it ended. "They were torturing her. Now you understand why I couldn't walk away." Naomi wiped tears from her eyes. "I thought you were being reckless. I thought you were risking our family for pride. But that woman, she needed you." That evening, as Elijah prepared dinner and told Isaiah about the new job opportunity, Grace Miller received a text message from an unknown number. "Your services are no longer needed at Mabel's Diner. Do not return to work. Final paycheck will be mailed." And in Ralph Denning's small apartment above the diner, Grant Whitmore sat across from the frightened manager, sliding a typed statement across the kitchen table. "Just sign it, Ralph," Grant said in his smooth voice. "Your lease renewal depends on keeping this simple." Mr. Baptiste became aggressive, the officers responded appropriately, and everyone wants to move on. Clean and easy. Ralph's hand trembled as he signed the false statement, condemning the man who had tried to protect an innocent woman. The next morning, Elijah walked into Beaumont Tower carrying 2 pieces of evidence that felt like weapons in his jacket pocket. Grace's video proved the officer's cruelty. Ralph's false statement proved the cover-up. Together, they painted a picture of coordinated harassment that went far beyond one bad encounter. Denise Holloway met him in the lobby, her sharp suit and confident stride making other visitors step aside instinctively. She led him to a conference room where Lillian sat reviewing documents, her reading glasses perched on her nose, and her expression growing darker by the minute. "Show her the video first," Denise said without preamble. Elijah placed his phone on the table, and the 3 of them watched Grace's footage in silence. Even though Lillian had lived through the encounter, seeing it from an outside perspective seemed to affect her deeply. When Officer Harlan covered her mouth, she unconsciously touched her own lips. "That's assault," Denise said when it ended. "Clear documentation of excessive force and civil rights violations." "Now the other piece," Elijah said, unfolding Ralph's statement. Lillian read aloud, "Mr. Baptiste became verbally aggressive toward officers who were conducting a routine wellness check on an elderly patron. When asked to step back, Mr. Baptiste refused orders and initiated physical contact. Officers Harlan and Pike used minimal necessary force to restore order and prevent injury to bystanders." "Every word is a lie," Denise observed, "but it shows coordination. Someone coached him on the language." She opened her laptop and pulled up a development proposal document. "After you called yesterday, I did some research. The South Harbor Wellness Corridor project is being spearheaded by Whitmore Development Group. Grant Whitmore is the principal investor." Elijah leaned forward, recognizing the name from the buyout letters. "He's been sending offers to homeowners in my neighborhood, insulting amounts of money with pressure tactics." "It gets worse," Denise continued, scrolling through the proposal. "Look at this language. Creating an inclusive community space with enhanced accessibility features, senior-friendly transportation, and dignified housing options for residents of all abilities. They're using disability rights terminology to market luxury development." Lillian's face flushed with anger. "They approached the Beaumont Foundation 6 months ago, asking for a $2 million anchor donation. They said it was about helping elderly and disabled residents age in place with better resources, while simultaneously forcing those same residents out through harassment, Denise added. Elijah felt pieces clicking together in his mind. The officers knew about an investor tour. They were clearing out people they thought looked bad for business. Mrs. Althea on my block got cited for keeping her wheelchair ramp because it supposedly violated setback requirements. Denise made notes rapidly. We need to document every instance of harassment, every suspicious code violation, every intimidation tactic. If we can prove systematic targeting of vulnerable residents to benefit Whitmore's project, we have grounds for a federal civil rights investigation. She pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. I've already identified 15 cases in the past 6 months. Mrs. Dorothy Hughes received 7 noise complaints for using her medical alert device. Mr. James Wilson was ticketed for parking his wheelchair van in his own driveway because it was supposedly commercial vehicle storage. The Patterson family faced sudden property inspections after refusing Whitmore's buyout offer. Lillian coughed slightly, covering her mouth with her hand. Elijah noticed the way she shifted in her wheelchair, trying to hide discomfort. "Mrs. Beaumont, are you feeling all right?" he asked. "Just tired," she replied, but Elijah caught the flash of pain in her eyes. "Fighting this kind of systematic abuse takes energy. I'm not sure I have any more." Denise looked up from her laptop with concern. "Lillian, your doctor said to avoid stress after the last episode." "My doctor doesn't understand that some things are worth the risk," Lillian replied firmly, though her voice carried an edge of fatigue. "Grant Whitmore tried to use my foundation's reputation to legitimize stealing people's homes. That makes this personal." She straightened in her chair, summoning renewed determination. "The City Council hearing for project approval is scheduled for next week. If residents testify about the harassment, if we can prove the connection between police intimidation and development interests, we can stop this. The challenge is getting people to speak up," Elijah said. "Everyone's afraid of retaliation. We need a safe space for them to organize first," Denise agreed. "Somewhere the community trusts." Elijah thought of the small church where his mother had taken him as a boy, where neighbors still gathered for everything from funeral meals to voter registration drives. Reverend Samuel Price has been serving South Harbor for 30 years. If anyone can bring people together, it's him. Lillian nodded slowly, another small cough escaping despite her efforts to suppress it. "Then we start there." Denise was already reaching for her phone. "I'll call Reverend Price now and ask about hosting a community meeting tonight. People need to know what they're really fighting." That evening, rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of Reverend Samuel Price's church as neighbors filed quietly into the basement meeting room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, and the smell of old coffee lingered in the air from the morning senior breakfast program. Elijah sat near the front with Lillian, whose wheelchair was positioned where everyone could see her clearly. Denise had her laptop open, ready to document everything. Naomi held Isaiah's hand in the back row, still uncertain about being there, but unwilling to let Elijah face this alone. Grace Miller sat quietly near the door, her eyes scanning the room with nervous energy. Reverend Price, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and gentle eyes, stood to address the gathering. "Before we begin," he said in his deep, measured voice, "I want everyone to know this is sacred ground. What's spoken here stays here until you decide otherwise. We're here because our community is under attack, and silence only helps those who want to hurt us." The first person to speak was Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, a thin woman in her 70s who clutched her purse tightly. "3 weeks ago, 2 officers came to my door at 6 a.m, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said neighbors complained about my medical alert device being too loud. But I live alone, and that device is the only way I can call for help if I fall." "How many complaints?" Denise asked, fingers poised over her keyboard. 7, Mrs. Hughes replied. "All in 1 week, all after I refused to sell to that development company." Murmurs rippled through the room. Elijah watched faces transform from fear to recognition. These weren't isolated incidents. James Wilson, A middle-aged man whose left leg had been amputated after a construction accident wheeled himself forward. "They ticketed my van for commercial vehicle storage," he said bitterly, "in my own driveway, the van I need to get to medical appointments. When I asked which neighbor complained, they couldn't give me a name." More hands went up. More stories poured out. Sudden property inspections that found violations no one had noticed before. Police showing up during family gatherings, claiming noise complaints. Code enforcement officers measuring ramps and lifts, looking for technical violations. Grace finally stood, her hands shaking slightly. "Some of you might not believe all this is connected," she said, "but I have something to show you." She pulled out her phone and played the video from Mabel's diner. The room fell silent as they watched Officer Harlan cover Lillian's mouth, heard Officer Pike laugh and say nobody was coming to save her, saw Elijah take the first blow while trying to protect a woman he didn't even know. When the video ended, the silence stretched for long moments. Then Mrs. Hughes began to cry, not from fear, but from relief. "I thought I was losing my mind," she whispered. "I thought maybe I was imagining the harassment because I'm old." "You're not imagining anything," Lillian said firmly, her voice carrying across the room. "What you've experienced is systematic intimidation designed to force you out of homes you have every right to keep." She gestured to Denise, who pulled up the Whitmore development proposal on her laptop screen. "The man behind this harassment is Grant Whitmore. He's using police pressure and code enforcement to clear the neighborhood for luxury development. He even approached my foundation for funding, claiming the project would help elderly and disabled residents." Anger began to replace fear in the room. People sat up straighter. Voices grew stronger. "What can we do?" asked Mrs. Patterson, whose family had faced 3 property inspections in 2 weeks. "We fight back legally," Denise replied. "Document everything. Record interactions with police and code enforcement. Save all correspondence from Whitmore's company. The city council votes on project approval next week, and we're going to make sure they hear the truth." Lillian leaned forward in her wheelchair. "I'm also establishing an emergency fund tonight. Any family facing displacement, eviction, or harassment-related expenses can apply for immediate assistance. No one should lose their home while we fight this battle." She turned to look at Elijah. "And I'm authorizing an advance on your consulting contract so you can make your foreclosure payment tomorrow." Elijah felt his throat tighten with emotion. After months of sleepless nights and impossible choices, salvation felt almost too good to believe. Naomi walked over from the back of the room, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, taking Elijah's hand. "I was so scared of losing everything that I couldn't see you were trying to save everything. What you did at that diner, protecting her when she couldn't protect herself, that's who you've always been." Isaiah hugged his uncle's leg. "Are we going to be okay now?" "Yeah, buddy," Elijah said, ruffling the boy's hair. "We're going to be just fine." After the meeting ended, Elijah sat in Reverend Price's small office, using the church computer to make the bank payment online. His fingers trembled slightly as he entered the routing numbers and confirmed the transfer. When the confirmation screen appeared, he stared at it for a long moment, hardly believing the house was safe. For the first time in months, hope felt larger than fear. At midnight, Elijah's phone rang. Denise's voice was tight with controlled anger. "The video is gone," she said without preamble. It disappeared from Grace's shared drive. Her phone backup was wiped remotely, and the foundation board just sent an emergency email. They're suspending the Dignity Project pending review of potential legal liabilities. Before sunrise the next morning, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, growing cold in his hands. The foreclosure notice was gone, replaced by printouts of emails that had arrived throughout the night. Each message felt like a punch to the gut. Naomi emerged from the bedroom in her scrubs, ready for her early shift at the nursing home. She picked up the papers and read them quietly, her face growing pale in the dim light filtering through the kitchen window. "The Beaumont Foundation is suspending your contract," she said, her voice hollow. "Effective immediately." Elijah nodded without looking up. He had read it 3 times already, hoping the words would change. They hadn't. "There's more," he said, pointing to another email. Atlantic Security Services withdrew their job offer. Something about character concerns arising from recent incidents. Naomi sank into the chair across from him. "How did they find out so fast?" "Someone's making sure everyone knows," Elijah replied. His phone buzzed with a text from his old supervisor at the security company where he currently worked. The message was short and brutal. "License under review. Don't come in until further notice." Isaiah wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, still wearing his superhero pajamas. "Uncle Elijah? Why do you look sad?" "Just tired, buddy," Elijah managed, forcing a smile. "Go get ready for school." As Isaiah disappeared down the hallway, Naomi's phone chimed. She glanced at the screen, and her expression darkened further. "Grace is coming over. She says it's urgent." 20 minutes later, Grace Miller stood in their living room with tears streaming down her face and a legal document clutched in her shaking hand. Her usually neat waitress uniform was wrinkled, and her eyes were red from crying. "They fired me," she said, collapsing onto the couch. "Ralph said I violated company policy by recording customers without permission. But that's not the worst part." She held up the papers. "Whitmore Development sent me this. They're threatening to sue me for defamation and invasion of privacy if I share that video with anyone else. They say I damaged the reputation of law enforcement officers in the line of duty." Elijah took the document and scanned it quickly. The legal language was intimidating, designed to frighten rather than inform. "This is garbage," he said. "You were protecting someone from assault." "Try telling that to my landlord when I can't make rent," Grace replied, wiping her nose with a tissue. "Or to the lawyer they said they'd hire to destroy my life if I don't keep quiet." Naomi brought Grace a cup of tea and sat beside her. "What about the backup? The copy you saved?" "Gone," Grace said bitterly. "My phone, my cloud account, everything. They got into my Google Drive somehow and wiped it all. It's like that video never existed." Elijah's phone rang. Denise Holloway's number appeared on the screen. "They're moving fast," Denise said without preamble. "Someone compromised Grace's accounts, probably through social engineering or a phishing attack. We can't prove it quickly enough to matter." "What about Lillian?" Elijah asked. "That's the other problem," Denise replied, her voice tight with frustration. "Her board is panicking. Beaumont Mobility Systems stock dropped 3 points yesterday after rumors started circulating about her involvement in a police brutality incident. They're pressuring her to distance herself from the whole situation. And her doctor ordered complete bed rest. Her blood pressure spiked during the board meeting, and she had chest pains. She's not taking calls." After hanging up, Elijah walked to the window and stared out at the quiet street. Mrs. Althea Green was struggling with her garbage can at the curb, and he started to go help her but stopped himself. What if someone photographed him helping an elderly neighbor? What if they twisted that into evidence of his supposed instability? By noon, the retaliation had spread across the internet. A local news blog called Harbor Watchdog published an article titled, "Decorated Veteran Loses Control in Diner Confrontation." The piece quoted Officer Harlan extensively, describing Elijah as aggressive and unpredictable. It mentioned his military service, but framed his SEAL training as making him dangerous rather than disciplined. The article included no quotes from witnesses and made no mention of Lillian being silenced or abused. Instead, it painted her as a confused elderly woman who became agitated when officers tried to help her. Elijah read the comments section once, then closed his laptop. Half the readers called him a hero. The other half called him a thug. Neither group knew the whole truth. That afternoon, a black Mercedes pulled up outside the house. Elijah watched from behind the curtain as Grant Whitmore stepped out, straightening his expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. The developer's silver hair was perfectly styled, and his smile looked practiced as he approached the front porch. Elijah opened the door before Grant could knock. "Mr. Baptiste," Grant said warmly, extending his hand. "I was hoping we could talk." Elijah didn't take the offered handshake. "About what?" "About your future," Grant replied smoothly. "May I come in?" "No." Grant's smile never wavered. I understand you're going through a difficult time. False accusations, job troubles, financial pressure. It's a shame when good people get caught up in misunderstandings. Is there a point to this? Grant opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. There is, actually. I've been authorized to make you a very generous offer. He held out a check. Even from a distance, Elijah could see it was made out for more money than he earned in 2 years. This is a relocation assistance payment, Grant explained. Enough to buy your family a beautiful home in a safer neighborhood, with money left over for your nephew's college fund. Naomi appeared in the doorway behind Elijah, drawn by the conversation. Grant's eyes shifted to her with calculated sympathy. Mrs. Reed, isn't it? I understand you work very hard to provide for your son. This money could give him opportunities you've only dreamed of. What's the catch? Naomi asked quietly. Grant pulled out another document. Just a simple agreement acknowledging that the incident at Mabel's diner was a misunderstanding, that you realize the officers were doing their jobs, and that emotions ran high on all sides. Nothing more. A non-disclosure agreement, Elijah said flatly. A fresh start, Grant corrected. For all of you. Elijah looked at the check again. It represented everything they needed: security, safety, a future for Isaiah. All he had to do was lie about what he saw, abandon the woman who tried to help him, and let Grant destroy the neighborhood his mother loved. He took the papers from Grant's hands, looked at them for a long moment, then tore them in half. My mother's house isn't for sale, he said firmly, and neither is my integrity. That same evening, Elijah stood in his mother's bedroom with a worn duffel bag spread open on the faded quilt. He folded his few good shirts with military precision, each crease sharp and purposeful. The movement felt familiar, like preparing for deployment, except this time he was retreating from a battle instead of heading toward one. His hands moved automatically, socks, underwear, the spare phone charger. He had done this so many times before. Pack light, move fast, leave nothing behind that couldn't be replaced. What are you doing? Naomi's voice cut through the quiet room like a blade. Elijah didn't turn around. He couldn't face her yet. There's a construction crew in Alabama that needs security, he said quietly, reaching for his razor. They don't do background checks. Cash work. You're running. The words hit harder than Officer Pike's baton had. Elijah's hands stilled on the duffel bag. I'm protecting you, he said. By abandoning us? Now he turned. Naomi stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, still wearing her nursing scrubs from the long shift that had kept her away while his world collapsed. Her eyes were red with exhaustion and something deeper, disappointment, that cut straight through him. Look around, Naomi, Elijah said, gesturing at the room. I've lost my job, my security license, my future with Lillian's foundation. Grace got fired because she helped me. Everyone who stands with me gets hurt. So you're going to let them win. I'm going to keep you and Isaiah safe. By running away? By being smart for once instead of stubborn. Elijah grabbed another shirt from the closet, trying to keep his hands busy so they wouldn't shake. You said it yourself. Miracles don't happen for people like us. I should have listened. Naomi stepped into the room, her voice rising. People like us? What does that mean? It means we don't have lawyers and bodyguards and billion-dollar foundations to protect us when we stand up to power. It means when we get knocked down, we stay down, because getting back up just makes them hit us harder. That's not what Mama taught you. Mama died leaving us a house we can't afford to keep, Elijah snapped, then immediately regretted the words. I'm sorry. I didn't mean— Yes, you did. Naomi's voice went quiet, which was somehow worse than her anger. And maybe you're right. Maybe she was foolish to believe dignity mattered more than survival. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of struggle and sacrifice that neither of them had asked for, but both had carried anyway. Uncle Elijah? They turned to find Isaiah standing in the hallway, holding something in his small hands. His pajamas were wrinkled from sleep, and his hair stuck up at odd angles, but his eyes were alert and serious. I found this in Grandma Dolores's Bible, he said, walking into the room. It has your name on it. Elijah took the envelope with trembling fingers. His mother's handwriting spelled out his name in the careful script she had learned from nuns at the Catholic school where she cleaned floors to pay for his education. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded to brown. "When did she write this?" Naomi asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Elijah opened the letter carefully, afraid it might crumble. The date at the top made his throat tight. 3 months before she died, when the cancer treatments had stopped working, but she still insisted on cooking Sunday dinner for the whole block. "My dearest son," the letter began in her familiar voice, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are facing a choice about this old house. I know you will be tempted to think of it as just property, something to sell or lose or fight over, but it was never meant to be an asset, baby. It was meant to be shelter." Elijah's voice caught as he read aloud. Naomi moved closer, and Isaiah climbed onto the bed beside them. "Your daddy and I bought this place with nothing but hope and stubbornness. We painted every room ourselves, fixed every broken thing, and opened our door to anyone who needed dignity more than they needed privacy. This house fed hungry children, housed broken families, and sheltered dreams that had nowhere else to grow. I am not leaving you walls and a roof, son. I am leaving you a responsibility, to be shelter for others the way this house was shelter for us. Not because it is easy or profitable, but because it is right." The letter went on, but Elijah had to stop reading. His chest felt too tight, and the words blurred through tears he had been holding back for months. "She knew," Naomi whispered. "She knew this day would come." Elijah wiped his eyes and kept reading. "I know my death will bring financial hardship. I know you will be tempted to see this house as a burden. But remember what I taught you about burdens, baby. They are only heavy when you carry them alone. The neighborhood needs leaders who understand that protecting home means protecting everyone's home, not just your own. Do not let them divide you from your people. Do not let them make you believe that survival requires abandoning others. That is the lie that keeps poor folks poor and good people powerless. The house is yours now, but it belongs to anyone who needs it. Make me proud. All my love." Mama Isaiah snuggled closer to Elijah's side. "What does it mean, Uncle Elijah?" Elijah folded the letter carefully and looked around the room, at the faded wallpaper his mother had hung herself, at the window where she used to watch for him to come home safe from school, at the doorway where she had stood every Sunday morning, calling the whole block to come eat. "It means the house was never just about us," he said quietly. "It was about everyone who needed a place to belong." Naomi stood up and walked to the duffel bag. She started pulling out the clothes he had packed, shaking them out and hanging them back in the closet. "What are you doing?" Elijah asked. "Unpacking," she said firmly. "You're not running away, and neither am I. Tomorrow morning, we're going to that city council hearing. All 3 of us. Naomi, they'll destroy us." "Maybe," she agreed. "But Mama's right. We can't protect this house by abandoning everyone else who's fighting for theirs." Elijah's phone buzzed with a text from Denise. "Board meeting went badly. Lillian may not be able to attend tomorrow. Her doctor is worried about stress on her heart. You may be testifying alone." He showed the message to Naomi, expecting her to change her mind about the hearing. Instead, she walked to the closet and pulled out his old navy dress jacket, the one he wore to funerals and job interviews, the one that still carried the weight of everything he had once been. "Then we better make sure you look like the man she believed you could become," Naomi said, hanging the jacket by the door. The South Harbor City Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy as residents filled every seat. Elijah adjusted his navy dress jacket and tried to ignore the pain from his bruised ribs. Naomi sat in the front row with Isaiah, her face set with determination. Behind them, Grace clutched a folder of witness statements, while Reverend Price nodded encouragingly at neighbors who had never spoken at a public meeting before. Grant Whitmore stood at the podium in an expensive suit, his presentation screen glowing with beautiful images, parks with walking trails, modern apartments with wide doorways, medical offices with ramps and accessible parking, tree-lined sidewalks perfect for wheelchairs and walkers. The South Harbor Wellness Corridor represents a 21st-century approach to community development, Grant said smoothly. We're not just building housing, we're creating an inclusive neighborhood where seniors, disabled residents, and working families can thrive together. The pictures looked perfect, clean, safe, nothing like the worn but beloved streets where Elijah had grown up. This project will bring jobs, increase property values, and provide the accessibility features this community has needed for decades, Grant continued. We're partnering with medical providers, transportation services, and disability advocacy groups to ensure no one is left behind. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some residents looked tempted by the promises. Others shifted uncomfortably, remembering the harassment they had faced. When Grant finished, Mayor Patricia Hendricks called Elijah's name. He walked to the microphone slowly, aware of every eye in the room. His jacket felt heavy with the weight of his mother's expectations and his own fears. "My name is Elijah Baptiste," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm a Navy veteran, and I live in the house my mother left me on Maple Street." He paused, looking out at faces both familiar and strange. 3 days ago, I watched 2 police officers humiliate an elderly black woman at Mabel's diner. They covered her mouth with their hands. They mocked her disability. They told her nobody was coming to save her. Grant's attorney, a sharp-faced woman in pearls, leaned forward to whisper something urgent in Grant's ear. I intervened because that woman reminded me of my mother, my sister, my neighbors, people who deserve dignity whether they own property or not, whether they have money or not, whether they fit someone's vision of progress or not. Elijah's voice grew stronger as he continued. But what happened at that diner wasn't random. For months, elderly residents have been ticketed for sitting outside their own homes. Disabled neighbors have been told their ramps violate building codes. Families have received sudden inspections after refusing to sell their houses. Grant's attorney stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Baptiste was involved in a violent altercation with police officers. His testimony is clearly motivated by anger and desperation after—" "I was defending someone who couldn't defend herself," Elijah interrupted calmly. "Just like I'm defending neighbors who can't defend themselves against intimidation and harassment." The chamber stirred as Officer Harlan entered through the back doors. Several residents immediately looked down at their hands. An elderly man in the 3rd row started to stand, then sat back down quickly when he saw Harlan's uniform. Elijah noticed the man's fear and stopped his testimony mid-sentence. "Sir," he said, looking directly at the elderly resident, "did you want to speak?" The man, Mr. Joseph Bell, Elijah realized, tried again to stand, but his hands shook as he gripped his walker. His eyes darted to Officer Harlan, then back to the floor. Elijah stepped away from the podium and walked down the aisle to Joseph's row. "Take your time," Elijah said gently, offering his arm for support. "We're all here with you." The room fell completely silent as Joseph slowly made his way to the microphone, leaning on both his walker and Elijah's steady presence. Joseph's voice was quiet but clear. "They ticketed me for sitting outside my own home." Joseph's quiet words broke something open in the room. The elderly man's courage rippled through the chamber, like a stone dropped in still water. A woman in scrubs stood up from the middle section. "My name is Patricia Williams. I'm a home health aide." Her voice shook but grew stronger with each word. "Last month, I was helping Mrs. Johnson get off the bus at her regular stop when Officer Pike told us we were blocking traffic. Mrs. Johnson uses a walker and moves slowly, but Pike wouldn't wait. He grabbed her arm and pulled her off the bus before I could help her down safely. She fell and bruised her hip. Another hand rose, then another. A man in a maintenance uniform stood next. They gave me a ticket for parking in front of my own house. Said I was creating a public nuisance. I've lived there 15 years. Grace Miller walked to the microphone, her hands trembling, but her voice clear. "I recorded what happened at Mabel's diner. Officer Pike hit Mr. Baptiste first with his baton. Mr. Baptiste only fought to protect Mrs. Beaumont. I sent the video to help. and I was fired the next day. My manager said I was causing trouble. Naomi rose from her seat, surprising Elijah. I'm Naomi Reed, Elijah's sister. My family lives in his mother's house because our apartment flooded and we couldn't afford repairs. Every week, more families leave our neighborhood, not because they want to, but because they're scared. Scared of tickets they can't pay, scared of inspections that find problems that were never problems before, scared of police who treat sitting on your own porch like a crime. Grant's attorney shot to her feet. Your Honor, these are emotional accusations without evidence. This council cannot base zoning decisions on hearsay and personal grievances. Mr. Whitmore's development project has been thoroughly vetted by city planning and meets all. The chamber doors opened with a soft whoosh of air conditioning. Every head turned as Lillian Beaumont entered in her wheelchair, with Denise Holloway walking beside her carrying a briefcase. Lillian moved slowly down the center aisle, her silver hair neat, her dark eyes taking in every face in the room. When she reached the front, Denise helped position her wheelchair near the microphone. "My name is Lillian Beaumont," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I am the founder and majority owner of Beaumont Mobility Systems." A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Even Grant Whitmore straightened in his chair. 3 days ago, I sat in Mabel's diner waiting for my transportation. I was wearing ordinary clothes because I wanted to see how this community treats its most vulnerable residents when no cameras are watching, no reporters are present, and no reward is expected. Lillian's fingers moved to the small pendant at her throat. This device doesn't just call for help. It records audio for legal protection. Everything that happened at Mabel's diner was preserved, including Officer Pike telling me that nobody was coming to save me, and Officer Harlan telling the manager they were clearing the block before the investor tour. The chamber erupted. Grant's attorney stood up again, her face pale. That recording would be inadmissible without. Denise stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the table in front of the city council. The metadata has been verified by 3 independent forensic analysts. The chain of custody is documented. The recording is authentic and legally admissible. Lillian's voice cut through the noise. Furthermore, Beaumont Mobility Systems is immediately withdrawing all consideration from Mr. Whitmore's development proposal. Instead, I am establishing a $200 million community trust, controlled by residents themselves, with Mr. Baptiste as the founding director. Grant's polished smile collapsed entirely. Reporters rushed forward with cameras and microphones, while Officers Harlan and Pike were quietly escorted toward the back doors by other officers who looked deeply uncomfortable. The morning sun caught the brass nameplate as Elijah turned the key in the glass doors of the Beaumont Dignity Center. 1 year had passed since the city council hearing that changed everything, where Grant Whitmore once planned luxury apartments. A converted warehouse now housed offices, meeting rooms, a legal clinic, and a workshop where veterans built wheelchair ramps. The investigation that followed had peeled back layers of corruption like old paint. Text messages revealed Officer Harlan coordinating with Grant's security team. Bank records showed payments to city officials for expedited permits and delayed inspections. Ralph Denning admitted under oath that he'd been pressured to sign the false statement about Elijah, and within weeks he'd sold Mabel's Diner to a cooperative of longtime employees. Grace Miller walked through the center's front doors, carrying coffee and a folder of intake forms. As outreach coordinator, she connected families with emergency housing funds, disability advocates, and legal aid. The nervous waitress, who once feared speaking up, now testified at state hearings about police accountability. "Morning, Grace," Elijah said, adjusting his tie. The executive director position still felt surreal some days, but the work felt right. Veterans on his staff escorted seniors to medical appointments, repaired broken ramps, and provided safe transportation for disabled residents who'd been ignored for too long. "Mrs. Washington called about her heating bill," Grace said, setting the coffee on his desk, "and the nursing school wants to schedule another visit." Naomi was thriving in the program, supported by a foundation scholarship that covered tuition, books, and child care. Isaiah often came to the center after school, helping file papers and learning that service looked like showing up every day. "Lillian's coming for lunch," Elijah said, checking his calendar. "She wants to discuss the expansion into 3 more neighborhoods." When Lillian had first offered him a job, she'd thought she was rescuing one man. Instead, he'd proven that an entire community deserved power over their own lives. The trust operated with residents holding board seats, veterans leading programs, and seniors setting priorities. Dignity wasn't charity. It was justice. At noon, Elijah walked to Mabel's diner, now brighter and busier than ever. The cooperative had installed new booths and added a community bulletin board where neighbors posted job openings, child care offers, and mutual aid requests. The same space where Elijah had once counted coins for toast now served free lunch to seniors every Tuesday. Lillian sat near the window in her wheelchair, reading reports while waiting for him. Her silver hair caught the light, and her dark eyes held the satisfaction of someone whose wealth finally served her values. "How's the Richmond expansion looking?" Elijah asked, sliding into the booth across from her. 3 more cities want to replicate the model," Lillian said, smiling. "Turns out people everywhere are tired of being pushed around." Through the window, Elijah spotted Isaiah walking home from school with his backpack bouncing. The boy paused when he saw an elderly man struggling with a broken walker on the sidewalk. Before Elijah could even stand, Isaiah had already crossed the street. The boy knelt beside the man, examining the bent wheel with the careful attention Elijah had taught him. Then Isaiah offered his arm, just as Elijah had done for Mr. Bell at the council hearing. "Let me help you to the bus stop, sir," Isaiah said, his young voice carrying the same steady kindness Elijah had learned from his mother. "You're not alone." Lillian followed Elijah's gaze and smiled from her wheelchair, watching the circle complete itself in the bright afternoon sun. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please like the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.